Alright, this is Module 9, Rhombuses, Rectangles, and Squares. In this, what I would like you to do by the end of this is be able to use properties of rhombuses, rectangles, and squares, be able to classify the types of quadrilaterals. If I ask what a certain type is, be specific in the name. We're going to identify what a rhombus is, what a rectangle is, and what a square is. A lot of these you have used in middle school mathematics, but we're going to go a little more in depth with the theory of it. You need to remember the parallelogram and all the 6 properties that we had in the previous module. 6 properties is key. Just in case you don't have them handy, I'll say them here. We have both pairs of opposite sides are parallel, both pairs of opposite sides are congruent, opposite angles are congruent, consecutive angles are supplementary, one pair of opposite sides is congruent and parallel, diagonals bisect each other. Biconditional statement, just because we're going to be using biconditional statements within some of the theorems that we're doing. Okay, so the first thing is a rhombus. What a rhombus is, it's a quadrilateral that has 4 congruent sides. And we will say that ABCD is a rhombus if and only if we know that all 4 sides are congruent. So AB is congruent to BC, which is congruent to CD, which is congruent to AD's segment. So, a rectangle, again, it's a quadrilateral if it has 4 congruent angles. So, 4 congruent angles, not pertaining to sides. And if it has 4 congruent angles, remember, if we have 4 sides, quadrilateral, 4 congruent angles, that means each one of the angles has to measure 90 degrees. That's why it's labeled 90 degrees. So, ABCD is a rectangle if and only if angle A, angle B, angle C, and angle D are all right angles, or are congruent angles. If we combine the two, the rhombus and the rectangle, together, we get a square. So quadrilateral is a rhombus and a rectangle, all the properties of a rhombus and a rectangle combined. And the other thing is, you need to remember, all of these are still parallelograms. So you need to remember the 6 properties of the parallelograms plus the special properties of the rectangle, the square, and the rhombus. Okay, here's our first example. It says classify the quadrilateral. Looking here, we see the labeling. We have 4 congruent sides. The angle, one of the angles is labeled as 70 degrees, and you can technically figure out all the other ones once you know about the actual figure itself. Since it has 4 congruent sides, the most apt name for it is a rhombus. Okay, and that's it. Once you know it's a rhombus, then you can follow suit for all of the other properties that are associated with a rhombus and a parallelogram as well. Number 2, so we have a quadrilateral has 4 congruent sides and 4 congruent angles. Sketch the quadrilateral and classify it. So, if we know it's a quadrilateral, that means it has 4 sides. So 1, 2, 3, 4. It has 4 congruent sides. So how do you label congruent sides? 1, 2, 3, 4. It has 4 congruent angles. So we know it's 4 congruent angles. 1, 2, 3, 4. Looking at this, at the labeling, I see I have both a rectangle because of the right angles, and I also have a rhombus as well because of the dash marks of the labeled congruent sides. So a rectangle and a rhombus combined together, this would be a square because it has the properties of both a rectangle and a rhombus. Okay, so these 3 theorems are added on properties. Again, remember, a parallelogram is a rhombus if and only if its diagonals are perpendicular. So I established this in one of the previous parts, but it's a parallelogram. So that means those 6 properties that I stated in the previous module follow suit for this, as well as 4 congruent sides, as well as diagonals are perpendicular, which means they create right angles. The thing that I tell people with this, if it creates right angles, think about what kind of triangles do you see within here? Right triangles. So if they're right triangles, that means you can use trigonometry to find certain parts, Pythagorean theorem to find certain parts, or even special right triangles, the 45, 45, 90, or 30, 60, 90 triangles. And you might have to use those in some of your questions that you run into. Theorem 8.12, parallelogram is a rhombus if and only if each diagonal bisects a pair of opposite angles. So that means that your angles are bisected and they are congruent. So this angle would be congruent with this angle. This angle here, angle C, would be congruent to this angle because it bisects a pair of opposite angles. It would also hold true for angle B would be split up into two congruent angles as well. Angle D would be congruent as well into two angles because it bisects a pair of opposite angles. And theorem 8.13, or 8.13, a parallelogram is a rectangle if and only if its diagonals are going to be congruent. So, it's a parallelogram. Its diagonals bisect each other, but the only special property is they don't just bisect each other, they're the exact same length. The diagonals are going to be the exact same length. So, if the diagonals are congruent and they bisect each other, that means it's a parallelogram. It also means that it is a rectangle, which means it holds all the properties of a rectangle. So these three properties, these three theorems, along with your definition of what a rhombus is, what a rectangle is, and what a square is, are very important within this module and within this unit as well. Okay, so another example. So we have sketch rectangle ABCD and list everything you know about it. So this is something you can either pause the video and try and see if you can do it on your own. But I'm going to give you the answer here just so you know. Give you a little bit of time if you did want to pause the video. It's a rectangle, ABCD, lists everything you know about it. So first thing I need to do, label it A, B, C, D. And I know in a rectangle we have four congruent angles, so four right angles. That's one property. Diagonals bisect each other and they are congruent. That's another property. Opposite pair of sides are congruent. That's another property. Opposite pair of sides, both pairs of opposite sides are parallel. That's another property. Consecutive angles are supplementary. That's another property. And opposite angles are congruent as well. So there are a lot of properties about rectangles. Okay, so how could this actually help out? Carpentry. You are building a frame for a window. The window will be installed in the opening diagram that we show here. So I have labeled here 33 inches, 33 inches, 44 inches, 44 inches. Okay? The opening must be a rectangle. Given the measurements in the diagram, can you assume that it is? Well, we know opposite sides, both pairs of opposite sides are congruent. Okay, so that's a good thing. But do we know anything about the angles, the diagonals, or anything like that? In this case, no, we don't. No, because we know nothing about the angles, the diagonals, etc., various other parts of a rectangle. All we know is about the opposite sides. They are congruent. So, this has to be a parallelogram. That's it. We know nothing about the angles, so it could be a shifted over parallelogram, which means this would not be plumb. Okay, so we measure the diagonals of the opening. The diagonals are 54.8 inches and 55.3 inches. What can you conclude about the shape of the opening? Well, since we know it's 54.8 inches from here to here, one of the diagonals, okay, I'm just picking one, could be the other one. So let's say this is 54.8, and then this diagonal here is 55.3. We know the diagonals are not equal. They're not congruent. So automatically, if we know the diagonals are not congruent, so this would not be a rectangle. It's still just a parallelogram because we know the diagonals are not congruent. Therefore, it can't be right angles that are created because of that property. We still know nothing about these. But again, since we know the diagonals are not congruent, that means it can't be a rectangle.